Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. In honor of this month's Classical Wisdom Literary Magazine, which is on ancient Persia, we have a special guest for today's episode. I'm speaking with Stephen Dando-Collins, the award-winning author of 40 books, including Rise of an Empire, on which the major motion picture 300 Rise of an Empire was based. In today's discussion, we talk about his most recent book, Cyrus the Great, which delves into the true history of the founder of the Persian Empire. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now, on to the truth about the founder of the Persian Empire, why Cyrus was considered great, the Anointed One, as well as one of the originators of human rights. Does he deserve these incredible accolades, and how can we really know anything about him? It's such an interesting topic. I think Cyrus the Great is one of those just absolutely fascinating characters from the ancient world. But he's not given that much attention normally. I mean, he's given maybe more attention than some people from ancient Persia. But I guess maybe a good point to start for today's interview is to just remind everybody who exactly was Cyrus and why he's considered great.
Okay, for the uninitiated, Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Persian Empire. So he was born around 600 BC. And he was a native of Persis, a land in the southwest of today's Iran. And at that time, it was part of the empire of the Medes, the Median Empire. And his grandfather was the king of the Medes. And he grew up through via a very fraught childhood, grew up in his grandfather's court and rose through the court to become the cupbearer, which was quite a high-ranking post in the hierarchy of the civil service of the Median Empire. If you equate it with the Egyptians, the cupbearer to the pharaoh was the third-ranking official after the vizier and then the treasurer. So it was a high-ranking post, but he still had to literally serve wine to the king, to his grandfather. And it's interesting that he was 48 before he actually started on his career, and he went from becoming a 40-year-old, a middle-aged wine waiter to becoming the ruler of the largest empire known to man at that time.
Wow, I can't imagine that cupbearing would have been very helpful practice for becoming that position.
He at least got to know everybody in the hierarchy, who did what to whom, and so he was well positioned.
So later on, he gets the accolade of being anointed by God, and he's in fact one of the only, I think, non-Jews to get such a credit. How did he get that saying, that high prize, and why did he help the Jews?
Okay, so we have to go back a little way. So as I say, at the age of 48, he leads a rebellion of his own people, of the Persian people, against his grandfather, the king of the Median, ruler of the Median Empire. And he is successful, but after a number of battles. But he doesn't kill his grandfather, which was unusual in those days. If you beat another ruler in battle, your fate was usually sealed, but he allowed him to live. And this was one of the great things about Cyrus. He often allowed the other kings that he conquered not only to live. One, Croesus, the famous, as rich as Croesus, king of Lydia, he took on as one of his senior counselors, senior advisors. So Cyrus leads the Persian people via various ruses and a number of battles, and finally defeats his grandfather. So the Persians now rule the Median Empire, and that was quite an extensive empire in the Middle East at the time. Then he had to deal with the Lydians. King Croesus, as I mentioned, famously considered the richest man in the world, for good reason. He had treasuries filled with gold and gems and fabulous furniture. And when guests came to visit him, they would be taken on a tour of Croesus's wealth before they actually met the king. So Croesus saw an opportunity to invade part of Media, which he had long had his eye on. Now that this Persian fellow Cyrus was running the Median Empire, and assuming that he'd have his hands full elsewhere, bringing all the subject nations in the Median Empire under control. So the Lydians invade the northeast of Media, and so Cyrus is forced to go to war with the Lydians, but he does it very successfully, and does something that the generals of the time rarely did. Normally, if you were having a war, everybody went home for winter, and then came back and started again the following spring. But Cyrus, after a battle that forced Croesus and his army to retreat, followed him back to Sardis, his capital, over winter, and defeated the Lydians. So he then conquers the Lydians. So Lydia, which took up most of Asia Minor, is now part of his empire. And for a number of years, he and one of his senior generals, Harpagus, spend a decade conquering all the city-states of Asia Minor, the Greek city-states. Meanwhile, the Babylonian Empire to his south has been watching him warily, and finally he decides to invade Babylonia to restore nations which are part of the Babylonian Empire, to restore freedom to them. Nations like Elam, which had a similar ethnic background to the Persians. So Cyrus goes to war with the Babylonians, and after a decisive field battle, he approaches Babylon and very cleverly enters Babylon via a commando raid and takes Babylon. And he takes Nabonidus, the king of Babylonia, prisoner, and again spares him. So now Cyrus controls all the Middle East bar Egypt. One of his ancient biographers claimed that he also conquered Egypt. He didn't. It was his son Cambyses. But now we have this massive empire which Cyrus controls. And one of the first things he does at Babylon is frees prisoners of the Babylonians that have been taken in previous wars and allows them to go home. We know this from a thing called the Cyrus cylinder. In those days, their documents were made on clay or on stone cylinders, where they would etch all this lettering to tell a story. And on the Cyrus cylinder, which he buried in the foundations of a temple at Babylon, he tells the story of what he'd done the previous year, and one of those things was to free the people who'd been enslaved by the Babylonians, and he lists who they are, and they're all the people he mentions are from east of the Tigris River. But at the same time, he allows the Jewish people who under Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had been taken from Jerusalem to Babylonia. He allows them to go home. He makes no mention of this on the Cyrus cylinder. It seems to be just incidental to the act of freeing the people from east of the Tigris River. The people from east of the Tigris River all worship the same gods as Cyrus. But one of Cyrus's Greek biographers, Xenophon, said that Cyrus was very amenable to requests from his subjects. And so Cyrus allows the Jews to go home to Jerusalem. Now, if you read the Old Testament and then you read Isaiah 45, it says, this is where, as you say, Cyrus is described as anointed by God, or the God of the Jews, for releasing the Jews and allowing them to go home. But it also says he gave them permission to rebuild their temple, and he gave them back many of the artifacts from the temple that had been looted by Nebuchadnezzar. And so this is the reason that Cyrus is described as anointed by God. It's, according to the Old Testament, Cyrus was chosen by God to free the Jews and allow them to go home and rebuild their temple.
Could Cyrus the Great be considered the originator of human rights, considered sort of perhaps the true inspiration behind the Bill of Rights?
I would just love to say yes, but and this is a case of, dare I use the phrase, fake news. Thomas Jefferson read the Cyropedia. He was a Greek who lived a century or so after Cyrus. And he wrote this book in which he claimed to be quoting the great wisdoms from Cyrus. I believe Cyrus was a very, very wise man and a great ruler. But historians generally believe that most of the quotes attributed to Cyrus by Xenophon were Xenophon's own inventions. He was a student of Socrates, and I think he wanted to emulate Socrates, and the way he found to do it was to put his words in the mouth of Cyrus. So Jefferson, we know, adored this book because he wrote copious notes in the margins. And at the time that he was conceiving the American Bill of U.S. Bill of Rights. But essentially, his contribution was based on a novel because these creations of Xenophon were totally fictitious. There's no record anywhere that equates with many of the observations and wisdoms that he put in the mouth of Xenophon. So if you come forward then to 2006, there was a book published in the US by Larry Hedrick. It was a how-to book, and it was called Xenophon's Cyrus the Great, The Arts of Leadership and War. And so Larry Hedrick took Xenophon a step further and made him a how-to guide and added his own flourishes. And we find that in early 2017, the new US President, Donald Trump, sends a message to the people of Iran at the time of Nowruz, the Persian Iranian New Year. And he said, Cyrus the Great, a leader of the ancient Persian Empire, famously said that, quote, freedom, dignity, and wealth together constitute the greatest happiness of humanity. If you bequeath all three to your people, their love for you will never die. Well, this is a total fiction. So much of Cyrus's modern-day reputation is built on a rather rocky foundation.
It's really fascinating because you think of the Socratic problem, and that's sort of a common one that maybe the classics lovers are more familiar with, in which you can't distinguish between Socrates and Plato. So you mentioned that we don't really know what Cyrus did. Is there sort of a Cyrus-Xenophon problem, or is other historians
yes.
about him?
And there's a Cyrus Cassius problem too. A later author who wrote about extensively about Cyrus. Modern historians and biblical scholars have found his work to be essentially fiction too. Even ancient authors like Cicero found these other authors to be unfaithful. The one author that we can rely on, I think, is Herodotus, and he wrote an extensive history of Cyrus, which in many cases is backed up by inscriptions that have been found by archaeologists over the last few centuries. So even Herodotus, on occasion, is incorrect. But people like Ctesias, he said that Cyrus conquered Egypt. Well, he didn't. It was his son Cambyses. So there are numerous examples where he was in error. When it comes down to it, I mentioned earlier the site now in the British Museum, and this is cited as an edict and one of the original declarations of human rights. But if you read it, it's not an edict. It's a little bit like a modern day press release from the White House. It's telling about what the leader has done and what a great man he is, in part quoting him directly. And this is where we bring the people from east of the Tigris and allowing them to go home and so on. But it also goes on to tell how Cyrus worshipped the Babylonian gods, the gods of the Middle East, the Mesopotamian gods, Marduk and his son Nabu, and temples at Babylon. So to call this a human rights declaration, which it is in the United Nations, there's a copy, if you go to the UN, in a glass box there, and it's called the very first human rights declaration. It's not that. And I'm not the only one to say that. Many classical scholars have come to that conclusion. It's just a statement of what Cyrus had done in the last year or so.
Well, that's fascinating. You mentioned before the historian Ctesias. Is that his? How you pronounce it?
Yeah. Ctesias.
Ctesias, thank you. It's interesting because I hadn't really heard of that historian before. Is he? He doesn't really feature as much. Did he not really get acknowledged as being very valuable?
He read a book called the Persica, and I mentioned Xenophon. Xenophon fought about a century after Cyrus in the army of another Cyrus the Younger, who was trying to overthrow his brother as the king of the Persians. And Xenophon was in the rebel army, and in the other army was Ctesias, who was a doctor, and he actually patched up the king during the battle. And he claimed that he worked for the Persian king for 17 years and had access to their archives. And so he wrote this Persica, which he claimed was a much more official and correct history than Herodotus. Herodotus had written about 40 years before him, and he actually mentions Herodotus and says that he wrote fables. And this is an early example of authors trying to put down fellow authors. But many scholars today discount much of what Ctesias wrote, although some of his information is backed up by inscriptions and can be verified.
But so, I mean, it's really funny to me because Herodotus is usually the one who's considered not very factual. You're like, oh, Thucydides is the father of history, and Herodotus is the father of lies. Is one of the more scathing reviews of poor Herodotus. So it's weird to me that
Cicero called Herodotus the father of history. He believed the opposite.
Yeah, well, so maybe I do think we should be giving Herodotus more justice than maybe previous scholars had done. But why is there such a discrepancy between the literary evidence and the archaeological evidence when it comes to the other historians?
I think they used these other historians, like Xenophon in particular. They used it as an opportunity to show how clever they were in terms of philosophy and so on. His history of Cyrus would make a great movie. It has all the elements of great battles and a love affair and so on. But it gets many of the names wrong and places and so on that we know sources to be true. So Herodotus the good thing about Herodotus was he says he gives you he said there are many competing stories, and he tells you about the different versions of in particular the childhood of Cyrus, but then tells you the one that he believes to have been the more factual one, and why. So he's in that respect he's a little like a modern historian, a comparative historian. Will lay out the different versions that are available, and then tell you why he believes a particular version is more reliable than the others.
And just to go in a different direction for a moment, what is the connection between Cyrus the Great and the Zoroastrian religion? Because I know that kind of comes out of ancient Persia, and he sort of had an interesting role in that.
Again, because of this reference, anointed by God, in the Old Testament, many authors down through the centuries have tried to paint Cyrus as believing in a single God. And Zoroaster was a priest in Mesopotamia, perhaps 400 years before Cyrus. It's a little hard to date exactly when he lived, who believed that a single God, Ahura Mazda, was the ruler and creator of life. And even today, people follow his teachings, which were fabulous teachings. He taught that you should live a life of good without expecting any reward. And so a lot of people have tried to associate Cyrus with Zoroaster as believing in a single God. But if you read, I go back to the Cyrus cylinder, he says he believed in the group of gods headed by Marduk and his son Nabu, who were worshipped by most of the people of his empire. He didn't believe in a single God. Several generations later, we come to Darius, successor to Cyrus, and he, on one of his inscriptions, declared his belief in Ahura Mazda and a single God. And he claimed that his ancestors had likewise worshipped this single God. But there's nothing to link Cyrus with this Zoroastrian faith.
That's really fascinating. It's amazing how history changes when people sort of want it to fit a narrative.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel for the archaeologist who spent 20 years digging in a particular part of the desert, and he finds something, and he's been hoping to find a relic of a particular pharaoh, and he finds something and desperately claims that it proves his theory. This has happened with writers and historians too, down through the centuries of trying to create a narrative from not very solid foundations.
Well, I guess everybody has a theory that they'd love to prove right. Maybe speaking of various theories that people have, I noticed at the beginning, I was fortunate enough to get an advanced copy of your book, and I noticed that you had a coin at the very beginning of your book in which people want to compare Trump to Cyrus the Great. And I know I've spoken to you in the past, people also like comparing Trump to Caligula and just about everybody. So do you think that there's any comparison?
To answer that question, I asked Professor David Richter, Professor Emeritus at a New York University, who is a scholar in this field of comparative literature, to look at the biblical narratives and the Jewish texts to see if there's any. Oh, okay, my screen's gone. Okay, I asked Professor Richter to look at the Old Testament and Jewish texts to see if there's any historical validity to the claim that Donald Trump is the so-called new Cyrus. And historically, he very effectively points out that historically there's no comparison. They're very different people. Cyrus was a conquering general, a very magnanimous man, a very kind and generous man. And he says that in this afterword in my book that the comparison doesn't stand up.
I always think it's really important for us to study ancient history, but we do always need to be careful sometimes in overlaying past events with current events.
Yes. Yeah. They say history repeats itself, but uh, yeah, it's a fraught exercise, I think.
Now, just to finish up, because you've been already so generous with your time, can you tell our listeners what you're working on now?
Okay. Coming out next year, again with Turner Publishing, is a book called Conquering Jerusalem. Taking a springboard from this book and then the reference to Jerusalem and the return of the Jews and the rebuilding of the temple there. My field of study, in particular over the last 30 years or more, has been the legions of ancient Rome, and I've written a number of books on that subject. And a subject that's always fascinated me was the Roman campaign to crush the Jewish revolt of AD 66 to 73. And I've covered it in several other books in lesser detail, but I've now gone back because there have been so many fascinating finds, archaeological finds in particular, since I've first started writing on this subject, in reference to the taking of Masada and the Roman campaign to conquer Jerusalem. So I've gone back and readdressed that, and it's fascinated me, this new evidence, and it combines with what I'd previously learned about both sides. I try to give the picture from both sides in this battle for Jerusalem.
And can I just ask one very last question? What number book will this be for you?
That one will be book number 44.
That is amazing.
Yeah, and I'm working on book number 45 as we speak. So.
Wow, they're very prolific. I'm very impressed. So I just want to say thank you again for speaking with me today, and I will share relevant links to your book below. And yes, it's very, very interesting.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Classical Wisdom Society members can learn more about ancient Persia in this month's Classical Wisdom Literary Magazine, including a feature article by Stephen Dando-Collins delving into the true history of Cyrus the Great. Find out how to become a Classical Wisdom Society member by going to classicalwisdom.com and clicking Start Here. For information on Stephen's other books about ancient history, please visit stephendando-collins.com.